Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Now, the reason I acknowledge our First Nations people is because I believe that we have a great deal to learn from them about connection and respect. And that's a big part of what this podcast is about. Well, today we are going to be exploring sunlight and vitamin D and health and disease. My guest is William B. Grant. Now, William has worked at the level of senior research scientist in the field of optical and laser remote sensing of the atmosphere and atmospheric sciences at SRI International. Now, that's formerly the Stanford Research Institute, which is an organisation dedicated to delivering unique solutions for the world's most important challenges and transforming ideas into reality. William also worked at NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Now, as you will hear, he has spent a good deal of time exploring the problems of ozone in the atmosphere. Remember that hole in the atmosphere we're not hearing very much about anymore? It's still there, it's getting better, but he explored that, and he also explored acid rain, another major environmental issue. Now, Williams co-authored or authored over 60 articles in peer-reviewed journals, edited 2 books and contributed half a dozen chapters to other books with a focus on sunlight and vitamin D and their importance to human health. In fact, its importance to every cell in our body. He's currently director of the Sunlight Nutrition and Health Research Centre, an entity devoted to research, education and advocacy relating to the prevention of chronic disease through changes in diet and lifestyle. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with William B. Grant. Welcome to the show, William.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
William, I've been so looking forward to our discussion. I know vitamin D and sunlight are going to be our focus today, but it leads to a whole range of other issues. But I wondered if before we kicked off, you might just share with us a little bit about your own personal journey professionally. You've published so much on these subjects, but your background, tell us a little bit about it.
Okay, so I got a PhD in physics from the University of California in Berkeley in 1971, and I was working with optics and crystals and low temperatures and magnetic fields and all that. And then I did a postdoc in Berlin for 2 years, then came back to California and got involved with using lasers for remote sensing of atmospheric constituents. I worked for 6 years at SRI International, developing some prototype instruments, went to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, continued that kind of work, and then went to NASA Langley Research Center in Virginia in 1989 to join a team that had a working LiDAR system that can measure vertical profiles of aerosols and ozone and can be flown around the world.
Right.
The boss on this was a very good engineer and scientist, and he put together a good team and had a good instrument. And that was in a time when you're trying to understand what was causing ozone depletion and what about air pollution in the atmosphere and what was coming out of China, what about biomass burning, et cetera, et cetera. So I got to go on about 10 or 15 international field trips through that experience. And one of those took me to New Zealand in 1996. And as I like to do, I picked up the local newspaper and found a report of a study from Hawaii, the Honolulu Heart Study, reporting that Japanese American men in Hawaii had 2.5 times the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease as native Japanese. Now, that was a very interesting finding. The authors had no idea what caused it, but my mother had Alzheimer's, so I read up on Alzheimer's and found that people with Alzheimer's had more aluminum in their brains. I had also been doing a study in forestry for the Sierra Club in the eastern United States, looking at the effects of acid rain and ozone on the eastern oak and hickory forests. And the Ori Laux, the forestry professor I worked with, had introduced me to the ecological approach that's where populations are defined geographically, and you look at the health outcomes and the risk factors, and you do statistical analyses just like you do for people. And we did that for oaks and found that the red oaks were affected by acid rain. I'm sorry, the white oaks were affected by acid rain. The red oaks were affected by ozone. Well, the white oaks have their roots in the swampy areas, so they're very much in close contact with acid rain. Whereas the red oaks are in drier areas, and so they avoid that, but still get affected by ozone. And so as soon as I saw this paper study from Hawaii, I said, it's got to be the American diet, and I can prove it using the ecological approach.
Okay.
And sure enough, I found the prevalence data for 10 countries. I found the dietary supply data from the Food and Agriculture Organization, and I showed that total fat and total caloric supply were highly correlated with prevalence of Alzheimer's disease. In Europe, if you had more ocean fish, that reduced the risk of Alzheimer's a little bit. And if you had a rice-based diet, like in China, Japan, and India, Alzheimer's disease rates were very low. So I went to the University of Kentucky, where they'd actually studied the trace minerals in the brain, and gave a seminar. They said, fine, we'll publish that. So then I hired a press agent, went to the National Press Club in D.C., announced to the world that diet was a big risk factor for Alzheimer's. Mm-hmm. Well, it got on national news with Dan Rather and CNN, and it was like hitting a home run first time bat in the major leagues. I mean, this is way more than any recognition I ever got from my atmospheric studies. So I was hooked. Of course, the Alzheimer's Association said, well, we know it's genetics. We don't believe it's diet, and so we're not going to really endorse that. 10 years later, they finally said, yeah, diet plays a role.
Yeah.
The next study I did, a year later, I did another ecological study. This time was myocardial infarction for men and for women, multi-country study. And I found that for men, it was animal fat that clogged the arteries. For women, it was added sugars. Not the fruit, not the sugar in fruit, but the sugar that was put on into processed foods and poured onto food. And again, I went to the National Press Club, made my announcement. Well, not only did the Sugar Association rain on my parade, so did the American Heart Association, because they didn't understand that sugars converted to triglycerides, and triglycerides clog the arteries. And being a physicist, I didn't know my biology, so I couldn't argue with them. Mm-hmm. And so the story just died. But a year later, 1999, a couple of years later, the National Cancer Institute published these beautiful maps of cancer mortality rates in the United States. Mm-hmm. And you see the red is where you have the highest rates in the Northeast.
Yeah.
The blue is where you have the lowest rates.
Yeah.
And so the Garland brothers, Cedric and Frank Garland, had used a 5-scale map of colon cancer in 1974 to hypothesize that solar UVB through production of vitamin D reduced risk of colon cancer. It took them 6 years to get that published, and then it was in the International Journal of Epidemiology, published in England. The American journals didn't want to touch it, and after that they looked at dietary vitamin D intake and serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D, and showed that both played a role in colon cancer. Then they did other ecological studies. They looked at breast cancer. They looked at ovarian cancer, but they couldn't get much momentum going. In fact, I hadn't even heard of their study until I showed my findings to a librarian at NASA Langley. He says, "Oh, you got to look at what the Garlands did." Mm-hmm. And so I did, and I even emailed Cedric Garland and said, "Hey, look at this interesting finding. Where do we go from here?" He ignored me, which is okay because I figured out myself. Got the NASA data for UVB, which is on my website, SUNARC.org.
Yep, we'll have links to that.
A good inverse correlation between solar UVB at the surface and the colon, actually about 15 types of cancer. So I wrote up a manuscript, submitted to the journal Cancer, and they accepted it almost upon submission, saying, just get the text edited and we'll go from there. And it was published. Well, then the critics started looking at it and said, well, why did you omit the 3 states with a border with Mexico? And what about the other confounding factors? And so I started looking at it and found out that the white Americans I studied included Hispanics. And Hispanics during the Mexican border, a lot of them are Mexican, with poor hygiene, a lot of H. pylori risk factor, as shown in Australia by some famous Nobel Prize winners, causes stomach cancer and ulcers.
Yep.
So I then added alcohol consumption, smoking, urban rural residence, poverty, and Hispanic heritage, and redid the analysis, and it turns out that the UVB component stayed unchanged. But now I can say, yes, I've accounted for smoking, et cetera, et cetera. Sent this to 9 journals, mainstream journals. They reviewed it and rejected it. Finally got it accepted as a conference proceedings paper in a German conference published in a Greek journal. And now it has about 250 citations. And so it's sort of accepted as far as ecological studies go. Of course, the medical system totally likes to ignore ecological studies, saying they're hypothesis generating, but can't prove causality. So forget about it.
You've mentioned ecological studies, and boy, there's so much in what you've just said. Yeah, and what year are we up to now?
Because this was 2006.
Yeah.
So I retired from NASA in 2004 to work full time on health studies.
Yes, wow. Because you certainly picked the ozone entry. There was big news in at that time in the late 20th century,
Right.
But you've mentioned ecological studies a few times, and clearly, tell us a little bit. Give us ecological studies or ecological approach 101. What's the basic premise?
What you have to do is you define a population geographically, and like in a cancer study, you look at that case was mortality rate for cancer, for individual cancers in state economic areas. Now there are about 500 state economic areas, and I had to digitize the UVB map to that map. That took about a year in my spare time. And so once you get that, you just do correlations. You put in the UVB and the cancer mortality rate, and just look at in fact, it turned out to be a sort of a second order fit, because when you get to the higher UVB dose country state areas, people don't stay out quite as much. Maybe they have a little bit darker skin, so you don't get a linear fall off. You get a sort of a saturated effect.
Now, you've just to clarify, because you've mentioned UVB a couple of times, and I think we just need to remind our listener about what it is. I know it's ultraviolet type B, but give us that as well, because you've mentioned it a few times.
Okay, so solar UVB, ultraviolet B radiation, comprises about 3 to 5% of the noontime, midday, mid-latitude UV. So most of the UV is UVA. Just a little bit at the tail end from 290 to 315 nanometers is UVB. But that's what generates vitamin D. And in order to produce vitamin D in your skin, your shadow has to be shorter than you are. Now, the dermatologists say you have a shadow rule, which is if the shadow is shorter than you, put on sunscreen or stay out. The vitamin D people say when the shadow is shorter than you are, go out and make some vitamin D.
That's a pretty important. I mean, we've explored a few confusing public health messages on this program and in my work, and boy, this is a big one. I mean, how do you? Well, you've said the shorter when the shadow is shorter, that's when the time is to get out there and create vitamin D.
Okay, well. Nina Jablonski and George Chaplin have done a lot of studies on skin pigmentation. They've gone around the world measuring pigmentation under the armpit where it's not affected by sunlight. And what they found is that where you have plain states like Australia with the Aborigines, Africa, you have very dark skin is appropriate. When you have forested areas like Indonesia and South America, brown skin is appropriate. When you have higher latitudes, paler skin is appropriate. But there's another feature is that from about 20 to 40 degrees latitude, the native north latitudes, the native populations have the ability to tan. And so as the summer comes along and they go out every day, they get a tanning up to about a factor of 4 reduction in the penetration of the UVB or UV into the skin. It's like having an SPF of 4 on your skin. Now, what's happened in Australia, a lot of people have Celtic skin, and that's appropriate for high latitudes in Europe. But these people probably do not tan very well and are easily sunburned. But I was at a dermatology conference in 2017 in San Diego, and a bright young dermatologist, by the name of Dr. Scott, reported that in mouse studies and human studies, raising 25-hydroxy vitamin D above 40 nanograms per milliliter reduced the sunburning. It allowed the skin to sort of very quickly respond to too much UV and correct the damage. Skin has the ability to convert vitamin D to 25-hydroxy vitamin D and then 125-dihydroxy vitamin D. So it has the whole package there to take care of the damage. Now, anecdotally, I have a colleague, a doctor in Illinois, whose wife is red-haired and freckled. When she gets her vitamin D level up to 70 nanograms per milliliter, she can go out in the midday sun for an hour and not burn. So it's amazing how the body is able to take care of itself if you give it a chance. Unfortunately, this has never been explored in Australia about high vitamin D levels to protect against sun. Although now I understand that the part of the reason the coral reefs are dying is because of sunscreen getting in the compound, getting into the water and killing it. So maybe it is time to start thinking about have people raise their vitamin D level just to save the
yes.
coral reefs.
Well, you were talking, going back to acid rain and ozone. I think a lot of it's also some environmental toxins being flown, temperature and chemicals and that whole thing. But ecological approach is more an observational correlation type approach. And I know you've recently written an article. Well, we were going to talk about that. You did an article about observational trials versus randomized control trials on vitamin D. And I'm wondering whether this is the time to ask you about that kind of approach, because you've mentioned ecological approach, and we've been told randomized controlled trials are the gold standard in healthcare, and anything else is poor quality and should not be ignored. You've obviously gone into a lot of this over the last 20, 30 or 40 years. Tell us about that. Give us those different approaches and what your observation from that is.
Okay, so the main approaches are your randomized controlled trials and your observational studies. We also have Mendelian randomization studies now to look at the genetic variations of all the genes involved in the vitamin D pathway, going from production or intake to the calcitriol. So the randomized controlled trial is what is used in medicine to demonstrate that a substance works and does not have severe adverse effects. However, many of these trials have overlooked the adverse effects. Witness Vioxx that killed 50,000 people from cardiovascular disease because they didn't do long enough studies to find out that their adverse effects were there. Now, in a pharmaceutical drug clinical trial, you have the two assumptions. One is that the only source of the substance is in the trial. And the second assumption is that there's linear dose-response relationship. Well, neither of these is correct for vitamin D. Unfortunately, most of the vitamin D randomized controlled trials have been designed in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, etc., have done just like in pharmaceuticals trials. They divide people into two groups, those who get vitamin D, those who don't. They then give them a small dose. They then analyze the results on intention to treat. They look at the outcome for those who are treated and the outcome for those who are not treated. And if there's a difference, they say, oh, it works. If there's no difference, they say, oh, it doesn't work. Well, the problem is vitamin D is not the active element. Vitamin D contributes to 25-hydroxy vitamin D. If you start with high levels of vitamin D, 25-hydroxyvitamin D, taking vitamin D, well, it may increase your vitamin D level some, but if you're already at a level where you have protection against whatever outcome you're looking at, taking more vitamin D is not going to do anything. And that's what they found in the VITAL study, the whatever the study was in Australia, New Zealand, Finland, et cetera, for cancer and cardiovascular disease, and so on. Well, so Robert Heaney in 2014 said that what you really do is design these studies based on nutrients, not on drugs. And so you have to understand that people have nutrients in their system. You should measure those. You should then figure out a dose to take them up. If they have low values, give them a dose to take them up to high values where they have a protection against whatever you're looking at. And you've got to remeasure the 25-hydroxyvitamin D on an individual basis, and so on. Well, that was in 2014. Unfortunately, a lot of these trials were designed before 2014. And like the VITAL trial was designed in 2010. There was some concern at that time about U-shaped relationships between 25-hydroxyvitamin D and health outcomes in observational studies. Now, in my opinion, a lot of those U-shaped relationships were due to enrolling people who had high 25-hydroxyvitamin D at the time of enrollment, who may have just started taking vitamin D at the time, shortly before, because they had osteopenia or osteoporosis. On the other hand, for prostate cancer, there is an inverse, there is a U-shaped relationship, because the classical effect of vitamin D is to help increase the absorption of calcium and phosphorus. Well, calcium and phosphorus are risk factors for prostate cancer. So if you raise your vitamin D level, you're going to take in more phosphorus and calcium. That's going to raise your risk for ordinary prostate cancer. On the other hand, since vitamin D reduces the risk of dying from cancer by reducing the angiogenesis around tumors and reducing metastasis, if you have higher vitamin D levels, you're most likely going to have a reduced risk of dying from prostate cancer. So anyway, the Institute of Medicine put a limit of 2,000 IU per day on the dose in the VITAL study. And if you can make 20,000 IU per day, that's 10% of what you can make. If you start with 30 nanograms per milliliter, that's way above what you need for cardiovascular disease. Maybe it's above what you need for cancer. And so they found nothing in terms of intention to treat. But if you look at the secondary analyses, those who had BMI less than 25 kilograms per meter squared had a 25% significant reduction in all cancer incidence. Those who had 25 to 30 or above 30 kilograms per meter squared did not have a significant reduction in cancer incidence, even though they had the same 12 nanogram per milliliter increase in 25-hydroxyvitamin D or vitamin D. The thing is, if you're obese, you have a lot of systemic inflammation, and vitamin D has to climb that mountain before it can start dealing with cancer. As for the African Americans who had lower 25-hydroxyvitamin D than the whites, they had an almost significant reduction in all cancer incidence. And if you look at cancer mortality rate, ignore the first 1 or 2 years, you had a significant reduction in all cancer mortality rate. And as we recognize now, vitamin D is more effective at reducing cancer mortality than cancer incidence, because there are a lot of factors that affect incidence: smoking, toxins, obesity, et cetera, but very few compounds affect the angiogenesis and the metastasis. But New England Journal of Medicine will only allow one result in the abstract, and that's all the women who ran the trial would talk about to the news media. So the news media told everybody vitamin D doesn't prevent cancer or cardiovascular disease.
Now, just to come back to the vitamin D story, because you've mentioned a couple of, we've given us the sunlight 101 as well with the UVB and UVA, and it would be good to just remind our listener about the basics of vitamin D, because this is such a critically important nutrient, hormone, whatever we call it. Right. Give us vitamin D 101.
Okay, so you make vitamin D in the sun from UVB hitting 7-dehydrocholesterol in the skin, and that makes pre-vitamin D, and then there's a thermal reaction that completes the process and makes it cholecalciferol or vitamin D3. It then gets to the blood, and when it goes to the liver, it receives a hydroxyl group, becomes 25-hydroxy vitamin D. Now, this is the circulating metabolite that's most common. That's what's measured when you ask for your vitamin D level. Now, the kidney can convert that to 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D, which is called calcitriol. That's the hormonal version of vitamin D, and in the blood, it bounces off against parathyroid hormone, PTH, and the two stay in sync so that serum calcium is kept within a narrow boundary. If you get too much calcium, you have hypercalcemia, and you start to have very adverse effects. And if you have too little calcium, you have problems too. You're not putting calcium where it belongs, et cetera, et cetera. And for a long time, for the first 5 or 10 years after that was figured out, in the early 2000s, they thought that, well, if you just treat people who have cancer with calcitriol, maybe you'll be able to have some benefits. But then they realized, no, that would have raised calcium levels too much, so they tried analogs that would not affect the calcium. But what they eventually realized was that tumors have a way of signaling to the body and say, hey, I need more calcitriol. Okay, so what happens is when you have calcitriol, it goes into, every cell in the body, every live cell in the body has a vitamin D receptor.
Yeah.
And when calcitriol enters this vitamin D receptor, it activates the vitamin D receptor, and it then can turn on or turn off genes. So Michael Ehrlich and colleagues published a paper in 2019 in which they gave subjects 400, 4,000, or 10,000 IU per day for several months and looked at the outcome. They looked at the change in genes in the white blood cells. So for those given 400 IU per day, they had maybe 400 genes up or down regulated. Those given 4,000 had maybe 300 or 400 regulated, and those given 10,000 had about over 1,000 genes up and down regulated. So this shows that the higher your vitamin D level is, the more you're going to tell the system to do some good things for the body. I mean, we assume that the changes made by vitamin D are beneficial, turning things on, turning them off. Yep. Otherwise, why would they be there?
Well, I think your comment that there are vitamin D receptors on every cell in the body is one that is a pretty profound statement. Right. That I mean, sunlight is one way of producing. Is that the best way of producing vitamin D? Are there other sources of vitamin D?
It's a natural way. So most of the vitamin D supplements we get are made from sheep's wool lanolin that's UVB irradiated, and then the vitamin D is extracted from that and is put into supplements. And so that's the most efficient way to get your vitamin D. You can control how much you're getting. You can measure your vitamin D levels. You can adjust your dose that way. But in terms of diet, you have to have animal products. And the primary animal products with vitamin D are fish, ocean fish, cold ocean fish, like mackerel, salmon, sardines, anchovies, and meat. It turns out meat is a very good source of vitamin D. A study from England involving only white participants found that the meat eaters had the highest vitamin D levels, even higher than fish eaters. And they had 8 nanograms per higher vitamin D levels than the vegans. Now, if you go to the Middle East and tropical areas, historically, they could not store animal products. They needed refrigeration. And so their diets are very heavy into legumes and grains and other plant-based products. And so part of the reason they have low vitamin D levels, say, in the Middle East, is first a plant-based diet. Secondly, they put a lot of clothing on to cover up. Third, it's very hot in the summer, so they rather be indoors in air conditioning. Fourth, the government has not realized how important vitamin D is, so food is not fortified. And if the doctors just read the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, and Lancet, these journals now for the past 10 or 15 years will only publish a vitamin D paper if it shows that vitamin D doesn't work as advertised.
Right.
I mean, Michael Ehrlich published an outstanding review of the physiology of vitamin D in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2007. It's got over 10,000 citations. Could he publish it there now? No. it's still available. You can still read it, but you're going to look at these clinical trials that didn't succeed and say, oh, well, let's just forget about vitamin D. And of course, doctors are not taught about nutrition, not taught about vitamin D. Old doctors are taught about kidney stones and hypercalcemia and all that. In terms of hypercalcemia, there's a very interesting case happening in the United States. A vitamin mineral guru, a PhD who's published many books, finally realized in around 2008 that vitamin D was good. So he told his manufacturer of his powder, put enough powder in my scoops that they get 1,000 IU vitamin D per day. We started taking it, and after a month or two, he couldn't think straight, he had bloody feet, he had to cancel his lectures, etc., etc. So they called him mycoholic. Well, mycoholic first of all tests the powder and tests his blood. He found out 1 million IU of vitamin D per scoop, and he found out that this guy's serum vitamin D level is 900 nanograms per milliliter.
Wow.
And so they sort of did some chelation and, of course, stopped him taking the powder. Within a month or two, his levels got down to 400 nanograms per milliliter, and he's no longer hypercalcemic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you might expect hypercalcemia above 150 nanograms per milliliter, but certainly there's a range for different. So anyway, he recovered. I mean, it's not life-threatening. People don't die from overdose of vitamin D.
No.
And kidney stones are not.
A million IUs is probably overdoing it a little bit, but what is an ideal? I mean, I know when we look at blood tests, and often these are considered normal range, and that's more a sad comment on our society than an ideal range. But what is an ideal range? Not a normal range, because we know, well, I'm going to ask you how common deficiencies are, but what's an ideal range?
Well, grassrootshealth.net, operated by Carol Bagley out of Southern California, got around 40 vitamin D researchers together, and about 10 or 15 years ago, they decided on 40 to 60 nanograms per milliliter as being the optimal vitamin D level. And I've even published a recent paper, I think this year, on optimal vitamin D levels, and pretty much confirmed that if you look at the best studies for various outcomes, that's a good range. Personally,
hang on, William. I got to clarify this. The measure, because is it different in America than it is in Australia? Yeah.
Okay. I checked in the literature. A lot of your scientists will publish in nanograms, but I guess it's only the United States that uses nanograms per milliliter as a common basis. So in Australia, it's probably nanomoles per liter.
Yes.
And you have 2.5 nanomoles per liter per milligram per nanogram per milliliter. So if I say 40 nanograms, that's 100 nanomoles per liter. 60 nanograms, 150 nanomoles per liter.
Yes, I think that was a really important point, because I think, that sounds really low, but hang on, we're not talking about the same measures, of course. I say tomato. No, you say tomato, I say tomato, but we're talking aluminum. Yeah, okay. But so in your currency, if we're listening to this in America, the ideal range would be 40 to 60, but in our part of the world, using our measurements, it would be 100 to 150 or
150, right? 150, right?
And yet, in Australia, when people do the blood tests, 40 to 90 is considered the ideal range. And I know personally, the first time I ever did a podcast many, many years ago, 10 years ago, on vitamin D, I was shocked, because I hadn't really tested my vitamin D levels. They were at around 30 nanomoles per.
Whoa.
Yes, wow. Whoa, indeed. And they would have been like that for 30 years. And I have the health history to prove the ill effects of that, but that's a whole other story. So okay, that's really important to set the baseline for what is ideal. And you mentioned that the sunlight is one way, and meat. Now, it's interesting to hear you say meat, because back at your myocardial infarction studies back in the late 90s, you came up with animal products being a problem. And pardon? Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
And you're also mentioning seafood is a better way. And, of course, there's a whole issue around toxicity and sustainability in seafood nowadays. So, animal products that are raised pasture raised and finished there's a difference. Not all animal products are the same, are they?
Well, when you have a pasture raised beef, for example, that's not ecologically sound, because you use a large amount of land for for producing the beef. So
Okay. I'm gonna refer you to another podcast we've done, but we're not going to talk about that now. But still, the point being that vitamin D levels. How common is vitamin D deficiency?
Okay, I looked up the data for Australia, and at least in around 2010, 2015, around 20% of the population had below 50 nanomoles per liter, and it said another 40% had between 50 and 50 and 75 nanomoles per liter, which meant only about 40% had above 75 nanomoles per liter. So there are a lot of adverse effects, serious adverse effects below 50 nanomoles per liter, and there are still adverse effects between 50 and 75 nanomoles per liter. So I also looked up the mortality rates for Australia, and they're actually quite low. As the life expectancy is quite long in Australia. So you have good health in general, and your cancer rates are lower in the United States, the cardiovascular rates are lower, all sorts of rates are lower, but you could do better.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if we're measuring that against the states, with all due respect, William, the bar is not being set very high. What are the stats in America like?
Similar. Well, the mean 25 for hydroxyvitamin D is around. Okay, for whites it's around 62 nanomoles per liter. For African Americans, it's around 45 nanomoles per liter, and it varies, of course. Now it's interesting that if you have a large seasonal variation in the solar UVB, that in wintertime, the vitamin D levels are about 50 to 70% of the summertime. And it's Rebecca Mason and colleagues in Australia who figured out what's happening. What they showed was that it's the 25-hydroxyvitamin D stored in muscles that's recirculated into the blood, maybe driven out by the PTH, the parathyroid hormone, to keep the vitamin D levels up in the winter. I mean, I always wondered why it didn't go to zero in winter, but it's because, like we mentioned, meat has a lot of vitamin D as 25-hydroxyvitamin. So do our own muscles, and that's the reservoir for wintertime 25 vitamin D.
And you mentioned adverse effects, and I think it'd be worth reminding our listener that, considering how ubiquitous vitamin D deficiency, and let's call a spade, that if it's less than 100 to 150, you're deficient. What are the adverse effects of low vitamin D or deficiency in vitamin D?
Well, you almost go through the alphabet. In fact, Henry Lahore at vitamindwiki.com in Washington State, he spends 10 hours a day sucking in the vitamin D literature, making it publicly available, systematizing it, listing what. But I'll just give you a few. You have Alzheimer's disease, you have dementia, you have cancers, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune diseases, including multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis. You've got attention deficit disorder, pregnancy disorders. In fact, I think 20% of the pregnant women in Australia have less than 50 nanomoles per liter, and that's a risk factor for gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, preterm delivery, maternal morbidity and mortality. So anyway,
I mean, I guess when every cell in the body is affected by vitamin D, it's the genes that really will determine how that may be expressed. But it's wide ranging, clearly.
Yeah. Did I mention diabetes? That's a very important one too.
Yeah, that's a huge one. Yeah. I mean, now, here's a silly. You've actually just mentioned it, but I was going to ask a really silly question because it needs to be asked in our current environment, and that was, does vitamin D have an important role to play in immune function? Because I was even going to ask you, does immune function still matter, natural immunity? Because you'd be excused for thinking in this current environment that we've been in the last 2 years or 3 years, this isn't an issue. What about vitamin D and COVID? What are your observations there?
Well, let's see. First of all, the vitamin D protects against cancer through an immune function.
Yeah.
It's looking for cells that don't belong in the organ, and if it doesn't belong, it would have it commit apoptosis or suicide.
Mm-hmm.
But okay, respiratory infections. I think it's generally known that if you have very low levels, like below 25 or 30 nanomoles per liter, you have a serious risk factor for disease related to respiratory infections. Now, I wrote the highest cited paper on vitamin D and COVID back in April of 2020, suggesting that vitamin D would probably protect against influenza and COVID. And it's got about 1,800 citations now. People have been studying it like crazy around the world, and they find some protection against it. They find that it's helpful along with vitamin C and zinc and other things in helping the immune system. But in my own case, I was taking 10,000 IU per day of vitamin D, and my vitamin D level recently, about a month ago, was around 270 nanomoles per liter. Yet I still got Omicron.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I still had a 5-day event.
Yes.
It was about a 2 degrees, 1.5, 2 degrees Celsius fever, and a sore throat one night where I couldn't sleep. But it only lasted 5 days, and there was no long-term effect. And then about a week later, I infected my partner. She reinfected me, and it only lasted 2 days. I think that's because the adaptive immune system protected me from getting to that. So they've tried to use vitamin D in treating COVID. And one of the problems is most of those trials are when people reach the hospital. Well, if you reach the hospital, you've had it 5 or 10 days. And what I hypothesized was that the biggest effects of vitamin D would be to, try to kill the virus through induction of cathelicidin, and to try to reduce the risk of a cytokine storm, which is what raises temperature and causes organ damage. Well, if you've missed the first 10 days, you've done most of the damage that vitamin D could prevent, and so you're not going to see much.
Yeah.
Now, there was a trial there was one in Spain that showed an effect of using calcifediol, which is processed vitamin D to where it's 25-hydroxyvitamin D. They used high dose, and it appeared to have an effect on reducing risk of going to the ICU and mortality. There was also a trial in Mexico involving health providers in hospitals, and these are people dealing with COVID all the time, and they took, I think, 5,000 IU per day and showed a significant reduction in development of either, I think, of the infection. So I wouldn't rely on vitamin D. It can have some effect. Masks can have some effect. Keeping warm. In fact, I got my COVID by being out in the cold weather and then going to an auditorium filled with 500 people with masks at night, some of whom must have had COVID. And so I had the system was sort of primed to not be very effective. And then I got COVID. So,
but William, I think it's worth saying, and I say this with all due respect, because if you finished your PhD in 1971, you are in an age group which was extremely vulnerable to the complications of, and dare I say, death from this pandemic. But 5 days on, you were fine, no side effects, and even when you were reinfected, that hit you for 2 days. So, I mean, there has been a very significant protective effect there from that. And this is the other thing too, looking at one nutrient in isolation, I mean, that's just not how the body works, is it?
Right. And also, you're right that there's what's called inflamed aging. As the body ages, the immune system degrades. And the same thing about cardiovascular disease. Part of the reason that happens at older age is that as you age, the parathyroid hormone level increases for any vitamin D level. And parathyroid hormone, I think, can put more calcium in the organs. And I think that may be part of the reason for cardiovascular disease hitting older people. So it's a complex thing that they didn't realize in all these trials about vitamin D and cardiovascular disease, that they've got to look at the mechanism more carefully.
But the whole, taking a step back from all of this, the importance of vitamin D, the ease with which it is controlled, I guess, or supplemented, and the implications for it being really so positive. why hasn't the medical industry, or maybe I've just answered that when I use the word industry, why hasn't the medical fraternity, that's probably a kinder word, why hasn't the medical fraternity embraced this?
Money talks.
Money talks.
I published a analysis of this in 2018 at Orthomolecular News Service, based on the Disinformation Playbook. Now, the Union of Concerned Scientists developed this. It's a 5-point program. The first thing is this is used by tobacco industry, the sugar industry, the energy industry, et cetera, et cetera. First thing they want to do is they want to attack the big leaders. So the year I wrote this, 2018, there's a big hit piece on Michael Ehrlich, the foremost proponent of vitamin D in the world, saying, well, he took money from the indoor tanning industry. He takes money from vitamin companies. He's tainted. The second thing they do is they publish bad papers and say these are good papers. So I think you can almost put all these randomized controlled trials that were poorly designed in a category of bad papers, trying to be good papers. Third thing they do is they spread money around. They will put money in universities, at the media, etc., for promoting drugs. And if university is doing drug research, we're not going to be promoting vitamin D as an alternative to cancer drugs and therapy and so on. Then the next thing they do is they will put their leaders, put their people in charge of agencies. Our Food and Drug Administrations, our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and our National Institutes of Health are all controlled by people from Big Pharma. It's called the revolving door. You work for the agency for a while, you go back to Big Pharma, you work for Big Pharma, you come to the agency, and all of these agencies are doing what they can to suppress vitamin D. And of course, the journals, all the big journals now, the mainstream journals are a part of the marketing arm of Big Pharma. And why would Big Pharma want to advertise for vitamin D? They don't. So I publish almost all my papers now in Nutrients. It's an open access journal. It has a publication fee, but it's very, very vitamin D friendly. And I tell all my friends, if you want to publish vitamin D, publish there. It's reviewed and published within 2 to 4 weeks. It's open access. You can get lots of readership, like my COVID paper. And you don't have to go through 9 peer-reviewed journals that review it for 6 months and say, oh, we're not going to accept it. So it's a way to get around the system. Unfortunately, you can't go to the media and get a press release because the media has been bought off and they're not going to play it. But so it's a matter of educating, trying to work with. A lot of my work has resulted in research done at universities. The cancer work I did, studied at Harvard and elsewhere. There's some very good work being done in Australia now with the Mendelian randomization study by Zhu and Hyponen. They're able to show that cardiovascular disease is now causally linked to low vitamin D. I think they've shown the same for hypertension, for diabetes, etc. And it's what they've been able to do is stratify the genetically predicted 25 reductive vitamin D levels and show that it's the lower ones that have the biggest effect. If you just try to do like the clinical trials, is vitamin D or not vitamin D is too coarse. But
excuse me, those 5 points, boy, we are talking about vitamin D here, but we could be talking about any aspect of healthcare. I'd be very interested, although you may have already said it, about this is the way the pandemic has largely been handled too, hasn't it?
Well, yeah. Pierre Corey at the Frontline Critical Care Doctors Organization, I told him about this about a year and a half ago, and it just opened Pandora's box for him. He saw what Big Pharma was doing to ivermectin, calling it horse paste, saying it didn't work, publishing papers that show there was no effect of ivermectin, even though it's at the Nobel Prize in 1985. Yes. It's used for controlling malaria. It has no adverse effects to speak of. Yet Big Pharma just tarnished it, and he could see now what they were doing. So his book, The War Against Ivermectin, or War on Ivermectin, is coming out in January. It's available now through through Amazon, but it won't be
Mm-hmm.
available for another 3 months.
Yep.
But he's making the case that this just opens to show how big pharma operates,
Mm.
how they wanted to promote vaccines and high expensive drugs, and so any kind of treatment that was inexpensive, whether it be vitamin D, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, they found a way to put it down, and it's just exposed that it's our healthcare system in the United States is based on drugs and operations and chemotherapy. It's not based on prevention. It's not based on and then we have our dietary system with a lot of processed foods, a lot of animal fat and sugar, etc. So you on one side you make them sick, on the other side you treat them. And it's
Yes.
just
Well, I
so
think
that's why
that
this
I th-
I made Sunlight Nutrition and Health Research Center.
yes, and we're definitely going to have links to that, because I remember one of the great quotes, and I repeat it often, is from Andrew Saul, who is the editor in chief of the Orthomolecular News Service, and I remember him on that documentary Food Matters saying, "Poor health may make dollars, but it doesn't make sense."
Right.
I still remember that to this day, because it's so true of almost any disease we would care to cover. And it's a story that I've been following professionally for 20 or 30 years. But I have to admit, the last 2 or 3 years, even I am shocked by the level at which the influence of these industries, this playbook that you refer to, it's been turbocharged.
It's blatant now. It's not
It's just so blatant. I had a conversation recently with a young doctor who'd been out in practice for 10 years, and I said to him, "Tell me, if somebody offered you a drug and they said, 'Look, just take it, prescribe it to your patients,' and you said, 'Can you show me the data?' and they said, 'No, we're actually going to keep the data to ourselves for 75 years.' I asked him, 'Would you take that?' And he looked at me like I was an idiot and said, 'Of course I wouldn't take that. What kind of a comment is that?' And I said, 'Well, that's what that's what Pfizer have actually done. Except
the
yeah,
data are coming out now.
except the courts didn't allow it, which
Right.
is encouraging to know that at least the courts are willing to stand up for that.
Right.
Now, listen, if we were leaving our listener with some important basic recommendations based on all of the research and publications that you've done, what would be 2 or 3 points that you would say this is what you should be doing?
Well, so first thing is you got to try to understand what your vitamin D level is. And then you want to figure out how much vitamin D you're going to have to take to get where you want to be. Now, for example, when I was taking 5,000 IU per day, I got up to 150 nanomoles per liter. When I took 10,000 IU per day, I got up to it was 270 nanomoles per liter. It's probably a bit high, so I backed off from that.
Mm-hmm.
But I only weigh 135 pounds, so I'm light compared to many people. But the people who can benefit from vitamin D the most are pregnant and nursing women, and they should definitely try to get above 100 nanomoles per liter. As you get older, above the age of 40 or 50, you've got to worry about cancer, cardiovascular disease, infectious diseases, diabetes, etc. And so you've really got to start taking it by then, if not earlier. If you have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, if you're taking too much processed food, and there's a risk of diabetes. If you're obese, you want to take vitamin D to try to get that. They showed in a diabetes trial out of Tufts University that even though the intention to treat did not show a benefit, if they looked at the achieved 25 hydroxyvitamin D levels among those in the treatment arm, those who got up to as they got higher and higher, above 100 nanomoles per liter, they kept getting more and more less risk of converting from prediabetes to diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
A very interesting study in Canada looked at people who already had 75 to 100 nanomoles per liter, gave them free vitamin D, 4,000 or 5,000 IU capsules, and said counseled them on how to reach above 100 nanomoles per liter. And lo and behold, 70% of those who are hypertensive were no longer hypertensive after a year. They reduced their blood pressure, their systolic blood pressure by 14 to 18 millimeters of mercury, and their diastolic by 12 or so. And no matter whether they were taking hypertensive medicines or not, they still became non-hypertensive. So here, where they can go around the drug, and even though they're taking a drug, they can have more effect by taking vitamin D. In cancer, if you get cancer, you want to start taking vitamin D. There's studies showing that breast cancer patients who start taking vitamin D after getting breast cancer have better survival rates. If you start getting cognitive impairment, you want to start taking vitamin D. So one of the big issues in all chronic diseases is inflammation. And vitamin D does reduce the risk of inflammation. That is reducing the cytokines, the pro-inflammatory cytokines. And like I said, people who are obese have more systemic inflammation, which is sort of setting the stage for all sorts of diseases. So I guess you can have your doctor order a vitamin D test, can you? I think there's publications in Australia saying it's a waste of money.
Yes.
But maybe that's because they don't want people to know what the vitamin D level is, so they won't be raising the vitamin D level.
Yes. Absolutely. I think the government actually, I think vitamin D tests were costing $50 or $100 million, and the government, in its cutting of costs, decided that was where they were going to slash the funding. So it gives you an idea of a chronic disease management system that is working perfectly, but not a very good healthcare system.
Can you get inexpensive blood spot tests in Australia?
Yes, you can. You can, and it's not expensive to have a vitamin D level done. It's maybe $30, $40, or $50, but what an investment! What an investment!
Yeah.
And in terms of sunlight, William, like it has been demonized. We've been told to stay out of the sun. I know that we've been talking about the effect of early morning sun on melatonin, its effect on melanopsin in the skin, et cetera, But what would your recommendations be around our relationship with the sun?
Get as much as you can. Well, I mean, one thing it does, it helps regulate circadian rhythm through melatonin, et cetera. Another effect, it may be that the UVA, the long-wave UV, may increase the serum nitric oxide, which can have cardiovascular benefits and infectious benefits. That's still a bit in research, but it seems to be. They've shown that nitric oxide does have important benefits for cardiovascular disease and infections. Also, sun increases. It warms warms the air, so warm air is better than cooler. By the way. I might mention that Robert Scragg in New Zealand, I think he published the first paper showing that there is a seasonal variation in cardiovascular disease mortality rates. I think he showed about a 20-25% increase of cardiovascular disease in the winter compared to summer in a study in 1980. They've shown that even in Kuwait. Now, Kuwait, it doesn't get very cold. Now, but the study in Kuwait was done in 1990, and they said, it's probably a temperature effect. Well, they didn't know about vitamin D at that time. So, you might want to look at the disease seasonal variations, and they probably go up in the winter. There's also a latitudinal variation of disease in Australia. It's been studied in these ecological studies, showing that some of the cancers and some of the autoimmune diseases have higher rates in southern Australia than northern Australia.
Now, listen, just finishing up, my last question I just wanted to ask, taking a step back from your role as a researcher and all of that, because we are individuals on a health journey through this modern world, and I'm wondering what you think the biggest challenge is for us as individuals on that journey.
Well, so my father died from prostate cancer. My mother died from Alzheimer's disease and had breast cancer. My sister died from breast cancer. So when I started my health studies in 1996, I posed the question, am I at risk of these diseases because of genetics or lifestyle? And I've been asking that question. I think after a few years, I realized it's probably primarily lifestyle. And so then I've spent a lot of time doing my own research through the journal literature, through my own ecological studies, my meta-analyses, and so on, trying to find out what's the best diet, what are the best supplements. I made some mistakes along the way. I overdosed on a few things, and I'm still paying for that, but won't get into that. But I think one has to sort of put a fair amount of energy into one's own health research, and not just do what the doctor says. I have a doctor trained in Russia, and he said, "You've got this problem." I said, "Fine, I'll go do the research and figure out how to solve it without drugs, without operations," and I usually do. Mm-hmm. So it's just take an active role, find a good health counselor, find a good source you can go with, and try to figure out yourself with some good advisors what to do.
Well, William, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and wisdom. And we will, as a reliable source, have links to your website. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed it very much.
Well, I've been looking forward to talking to William for some time. He is part of that board on the Orthomolecular News Service, which I would recommend that if you're wanting a reliable source of nutritional information, the Orthomolecular News Service is the place to go, and I'm humbled to be on their editorial board. We've interviewed other members of the board, Thomas Levy, Ian Brighthope, Michael Gonsalves, Andrew Saul, the editor-in-chief of the Orthomolecular News Service, Carolyn Dean, Richard Cheng. So it is a wonderful organisation. Interesting to hear about the Union of Concerned Physicians and the five-step plan to undermine anything that may in any way undermine pharmaceutical sales. Look, I think this is important. I think it's also important what William said when I asked him what is the greatest challenge, and that is to get a reliable source of information. And I would add to that to be part of a safe and trusted community where you can exchange ideas and learn from each other and from a wonderful group of practitioners. And that's what the unstresshealth.com community is all about. There it is. I put in a plug. Anyway, we will have links to William's site on the show notes, and it is a wonderful resource which I would encourage you to visit. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well.
This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.